Well, welcome to the 10th in the series on maintaining good mental health, based on this book, I'm Not Supposed to Feel Like This, which was written by others as well as myself a number of years ago. And there's not many more chapters in the book to work our way through. And depending on how it goes, and depending on the situation with coronavirus and whether we are still isolated very much, I may or may not get to the end of the book. But chapter 8 is one of the really important chapters in the book, particularly for Christians. If you're not a Christian, if you have no faith, it may not make quite so much sense. But you may find it helpful to listen to, because there may be sort of parallels that you can draw with some of the situations that I'm going to talk about. Pretty much with this chapter, because of the way it's written, I'm going to read the chapter because it speaks for itself and it's perhaps best listened to. Where there is a kind of worksheet, I will tell you what it is, and then if you want to, you can kind of make your own worksheet to go with it. I hope all of that will become clear as we go through this video. But I hope you find it helpful. As with all of these videos, it's meant to be useful. If you don't find it useful, then lay it to one side. If you do, you're absolutely welcome to the material that is contained within it. So, how to get the most from your church when you feel anxious or depressed. And of course, most churches are not meeting physically. I think no churches are meeting physically in the UK at the minute. But most churches are doing things online. And if it's anything like our church, we're getting a lot of people looking at the material we're producing online who don't normally go to church, which is great. So there is a lot out there. Even though you can't physically go to a church building or a house group or meet in other people's homes, you can still very much do church. And there are a multitude of ways of doing it, many of which we're exploring in my church, Whitley Lodge Baptist Church in North Tyneside. So this is how to get the most from your church when you feel anxious or depressed. For someone experiencing depression or anxiety, there should be great comfort in knowing that all of the resources of churches and the Christian world are potentially available, and the local church ought to be, even at times like this, a source of hope, encouragement and support. At its best, the church is all of this and more, a tremendous asset to people experiencing depression or anxiety, assisting in recovery and restoring people for as long as it takes to regain good mental health. However, in order to access this support, we need to feel free to discuss how we feel with others. An important factor that may prevent this discussion is our own fear and concern about the stigma surrounding mental health issues, which can sometimes make us choose to avoid discussing our difficulties with others. It's sad, isn't it, that people who often need to talk because they're experiencing poor mental health sometimes feel stigmatized and therefore unable to share it. So the stigma of mental health problems. Even in the 21st century, there is still a surprising amount of stigma surrounding mental illness. People sometimes have preconceived and inaccurate ideas about it. Strangely, if a Christian develops a physical illness, they do not normally think that this is due to a lack of faith. Yet such comments are not uncommon about mental health issues. This is not surprising, since churches consist of human beings with flaws, prejudices, misunderstanding, and even ignorance about things like anxiety and depression, and this can create difficulty. Sadly, in relation to mental health, we frequently encounter an alarming lack of understanding among those delivering pastoral care and ministry. Coupled with this, there are still some fundamental myths about mental health problems that are held by a number of Christians, including some in leadership, that are likely to result in those experiencing anxiety and depression feeling misunderstood, rejected, and inadequate. The tragedy of this situation is that the intentions of those who respond unhelpfully are almost always good. It is simply a lack of understanding of mental health issues that creates an environment that is unhealthy or even damaging for those experiencing depression or anxiety. There is a chapter later on that I'll try to include in this series, which is specifically for church leaders. And if you are a church leader, I hope when it comes to that point, and if you're if you have the book, it's in chapter 10. I do hope you tune in or read the chapter. What are the main problems that we can experience in our relationship with others in our church? We've seen earlier in different videos that different thinking patterns can become quite extreme and unhelpful when we're experiencing depression or anxiety. They alter our view of ourselves, other people, and God. In particular, we can focus a great deal on aspects of ourselves that we see in a negative light and ignore completely the more positive things. This is a common experience for most people when feeling depressed or anxious, whether or not they have a personal faith. But for the Christian, there are one or two areas that can cause particular problems. I imagine this is true also of people with a different faith other than Christianity. These feelings are of false guilt and low self-esteem. Those are the two principal areas. The problem of false guilt. Among the most fundamental and basic beliefs of most Christians are these. Everyone is guilty before God of sin. Romans 3:23 says, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Also, we believe that Jesus died for our sin to set us free from condemnation and give us salvation. Romans 5 verses 6 and 8 say, for while we were still weak, at the right time Christ died for the ungodly. But God proves his love for us in that while we still were sinners, Christ died for us. The Christian faith accepts that guilt is a normal response when we have broken God's laws. In the normal course of events, guilt is a helpful part of the cycle of sin, repentance, forgiveness, and restoration. However, if we develop mental health problems such as anxiety or depression, this normal helpful cycle can become disrupted. Psychologists and psychiatrists have found that during periods of anxiety and depression, people may unhelpfully and incorrectly feel guilty about things that are either not their fault or about which they have already been forgiven by God. As a result, feelings of guilt cause them to feel that they are utter failures. Howard Gordon was a Baptist minister, the minister who actually baptized me when I was in my teens, and he worked for many years as a hospital chaplain with folks experiencing depression. And he's written about the issue of guilt, and he relates a conversation that goes something like this. Patient, I feel so guilty. Chaplain, God is willing to forgive everybody's wrongdoing. Patient, yes, I know that. Chaplain, have you asked God to forgive you? Patient, yes, I have. Chaplain, do you believe that he has forgiven you? Patient, yes, I do. Chaplain, then what is the problem? Patient, I don't feel forgiven. Howard Gordon goes on to discuss different types of guilt feelings, and particularly the difference between true and appropriate guilt, where moral and legal rules have been broken, and false guilt, where there is no real personal responsibility for the things we feel guilty about. It is this false guilt that is so often present when we feel anxious or depressed, and in spite of our belief that God forgives our wrongdoing, we just don't feel as if it has happened. So here's an exercise, one of the little boxes. Are there particular things that you are feeling guilty about at the moment? Have a think. If there are, you might find it helpful to get a piece of paper and jot them down. And pause the video while you do that, because it may well be that there are a number of things. There are sometimes people with issues of guilt related to mental health problems, issues of guilt going back decades. So give yourself a moment, write them down. try to be honest. Write down as many as you think you possibly have. Write down the embarrassing things. And you can tear the paper up if you want afterwards so that nobody will see. So, if you've done that and you're back with the video, now go back over what you've written and ask yourself and God if you are really responsible for wrongdoing in these areas. Is this an example of false guilt caused by anxiety or depression, where you judge yourself as guilty just because you feel guilty, even though these feelings are directly caused by the mental health problem itself? Consider asking a Christian friend whom you trust to help you with this exercise. It may help to hear someone else state with confidence that some of the things you currently feel very guilty about are in fact based purely on feeling rather than being based on something you should feel guilty about. Here is a key point. Where there are things that we can clearly see have been wrong with our lives, it is right to confess those things to God and receive forgiveness. Sometimes it can help if we are able to share these things with a Christian friend we trust, who we can trust with confidential information. It may help to hear someone else state with confidence that God has removed our sin from us. This idea of believing that things are true simply because they feel like they are true is sometimes called emotional reasoning. Emotions are very important aspects of all our lives, but it is also important to be aware that during times of depression and anxiety, our thinking and emotions may become biased and distorted. You may then feel guilty for things that you are not really responsible for. It is important to recognize that this is a symptom of your condition, and if so, that this feeling of false guilt will disappear as you recover from your depressed or anxious mood. Excuse me. Now, sometimes, very sadly, our churches can unwittingly aggravate or even cause feelings of false guilt. For example, in the preaching of sermons that emphasize the fundamental truths of the gospel we mentioned earlier, these truths can be distorted by our low mood so that we focus upon aspects such as condemnation. And the forgiveness and love of God are overlooked, an example of what we called earlier the negative mental filter. The Bible speaks about God's unconditional forgiveness as well as his judgment, yet we may filter out the positive and fail to recognize this when we feel depressed or anxious. This may also cause us to overlook another very important truth about our relationship with God, the fact that we have been justified by what he has done. What's the importance of justification? The biblical idea of justification means to treat as or to make righteous. The New Testament word for justification is formed from the same word as that for righteousness. For Greek scholars, it's dikaiosune. The point is that God doesn't just forgive our sin, he also regards us as being sinless and righteous. This isn't because he has a defective memory, but because of the great love he has for us. We looked earlier at Romans 3:23, where Paul speaks of everyone having sinned and fallen short of God's glory. Lots of people know this verse, but fewer know that the immediately following verse, verse 24, says this: they are now justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. Now, of course, simply reading this verse may not suddenly make you feel like you're forgiven, but it may help to reassure you that your feelings of unforgiveness are not from God and are more than likely a symptom of your current emotional state. Another example of emotional reasoning. However you feel and however much you think you are failing, the expectations of those you share fellowship with, you are not a failure in God's eyes simply as you are experiencing depression or anxiety. Try to remember this, otherwise you will end up carrying a far heavier load than you would otherwise receive, and this is likely to hinder rather than help your recovery. Remember the simple truth that with forgiveness comes justification. God says, in spite of whatever you have done, you are right with me. You are righteous. Now, let's move on to think about low self-esteem and understanding a little more about it. Because closely related to the difficulties we may experience in feeling forgiven or not feeling forgiven is how we regard ourselves and our value in God's eyes. Part of anxiety and depression is to bring to the surface deeply rooted doubts, self-doubt, and self-criticism. Thoughts where we judge ourselves as failures, or where we see ourselves as worthless or bad and damaged. These thoughts may begin to occur more and more frequently when we are anxious or depressed, and can become harder and harder to challenge and dismiss from our minds. We can sometimes begin to look for comments and experiencings that can confirm these negative judgments about ourselves. We have a negative mental filter. It alters our view of how we think others see us, and also how we think God sees us too. So how does low self-worth affect our view of the way that others see us? During times of depression and anxiety, we often end up feeling useless, awkward, or even flawed as a Christian. You may also be concerned about what other people in church think of you. For example, that they will talk about you in negative terms, or that you will be treated with too much sympathy. These fears will vary a great deal from person to person. However, common concerns result from mind reading and self-doubt. In reality, very few in your fellowship will think this way about people with poor mental health, and we are simply misreading the way they think about us, or if you like, we're doing negative mind reading. Try to recognize that the great majority of people in your church, your Christian friends, your Christian brothers and sisters, the great majority will accept you as you are and only want the best for you. The chance look or the casual remark are most unlikely to carry the negative significance you may attach to them when you are feeling low or anxious. You may recognize this kind of doubting yourself when in church, which of course we're not at the minute, or with people you have previously felt very comfortable with. However, generally speaking, the impression that sometimes we have, and people really do have this, if you feel this, you're really not alone. It's very common. The impression that we can get that folk huddled together in a group are talking about us is just that, an impression. It's fed by some of the negative thoughts we are having about ourselves. It's far more likely that they're talking about the condition of the church drains, the weather, or the latest football results. They're not talking about us at all. That is just our negative mindset that is causing that. So low self-worth affects our view of how God sees us as well. We have a similar difficulty thinking that God will accept us, or perhaps God will accept us only reluctantly and with little enthusiasm or love. In reality, when God receives us, it is as children and heirs rather than as orphans or beggars. This is one of the messages of the parable of the prodigal son in Luke 15, verses 11 to 31. The wayward son had wasted away his share of his father's inheritance and decided to return home with a carefully prepared speech. Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands. His father, however, scanning the horizon for his lost son, saw him coming in the distance, ran to him, put his arms around him and kissed him. Cutting short the carefully prepared speech, the father instructed the servants thus: quickly bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger, the sandals on his feet, and get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And in that wonderful parable that Jesus told, there are a number of significant items, but 3 particular. Clothing. Clothing is significant. The finest robe speaks about the status of sonship. The ring is an emblem of authority, and the shoes imply that he is a free man and not a servant. And so sonship is restored to this person who's gone off and made a real mess of his life. And if that is true of somebody who really did make a complete mess of things, that the father couldn't wait to embrace his child again and say, welcome back, I don't think there are any of us that really have to worry. Here is a key point. Our status in God's eyes is that of children and heirs, heirs of God, co-heirs with Christ. We have the authority of God to live as his children. We are free from condemnation and the consequences of our sinful nature. If we judge ourselves as useless or worthless and a burden rather than an asset to God, it's really important to understand that these feelings are just that. They're feelings. They are a symptom of how we see ourselves, and they're certainly not how God sees us. Difficulties of ruminating over feelings of guilt and self-worth mostly reduce or disappear completely as we recover from depression and anxiety. Those feelings will go as depression and anxiety gradually subside. If you are feeling like this, it may help to keep some of the Bible verses that we've mentioned near to you so that you can reread them regularly and be reassured that however guilty and worthless you're feeling, that is not how God sees you. Now, the next bit is difficult at the minute, isn't it? Because we can't go to church. Physically, we can't go to worship services, but there is a parallel because most churches are doing services online. I think people are going to lots of different services, lots of different churches. We can't physically, however, meet together. So you may need a little bit of imagination. One of the things I've noticed is that there is a tendency for people who are struggling with low mood, feeling depressed or feeling anxious, to connect with online church slightly less frequently. And so, although we're not physically meeting as churches at the minute, nevertheless, this section really does apply to the environment in which we currently find ourselves. And it says, keep going to church or keeping going to church. Suddenly, it can feel very hard to go to church, even an online church. People with depression find it difficult to keep going. Disturbed patterns of sleep and low energy during the daytime are frequent symptoms of depression, may leave us feeling that we lack energy or motivation to go anywhere or connect with other people. And church may become a victim of our reduced activity. You may feel intimidated simply by being in an enclosed space, although, of course, that isn't a problem at the minute, but there is a metaphorical enclosed space, isn't there? You may feel under pressure to conform, to say things, to do things. You may feel under pressure to have a particular image to relate and interact with people. Sometimes if you are doing, for instance, a Zoom meeting with lots of people from your church and they're all very noisy, we can feel that we can feel very uncomfortable, and it can make us feel worse. It is almost certainly the case that if you're suffering from low mood, depression, anxiety, you'll feel like avoiding church. Not because of a lack of belief, but because of the demands that it makes on you. It is great at the moment, isn't it, on one level, of course, that we can join online church in our pajamas, and if you have them, rollers in your hair as well. We may feel that church is a demanding place, nevertheless. We may find it difficult to be with people, even online. On one level, it's important to recognise that all these experiences are a normal part of suffering from anxiety or depression. But having said all of that, unless your feelings are made worse by attending church online in some way, it is almost always better to stick at it. The difficulty in giving up any kind of church attendance, be it physical or be it through a computer, a screen, or a tablet, or a mobile phone, is that it becomes harder next time round. Having not connected once, it becomes harder to connect the next time. It can actually be the case that before long, church attendance, whether in person or whether via electronic media, becomes an issue and yet another thing that we add to our list of things that we have to worry about. So what can you do? You can reduce your church commitments. Sometimes people with anxiety and depression are in positions of leadership and great responsibility and doing lots of things, even with online church. It might be appropriate to do fewer things. It might be appropriate not to go to so many meetings, not to connect with so many Facebook groups, not to go to so many Zoom meetings, not perhaps to do quite so much online church. It's really good if you could let the leaders of your church know about how you're feeling and what you're doing, and particularly if you're going to limit the amount of things that you do. Go to a quieter service. One of the wonderful things about church at the minute online is that you really can choose the style of church you want. You can go to 6 different churches with 6 different styles, all in the same day. Some churches do quiet, reflective services where there is gentle music. It's not boisterous and loud and noisy. It may be that something like that will help you better. Likewise, choose which groups you belong to. There are lots and lots of groups meeting online now. Go to one that makes you feel better, with people in it who are understanding and supportive, and who understand also that there may be times when you really just don't feel like being there, and they will allow you the space to do that. Make sure that instead of church being a burden for you, it becomes something that encourages you, supports you, and helps you through. Establish supportive relationships within your church. Churches come in all styles, shapes, sizes, a bewildering variety of possibilities. You may go to a church that has been in existence for hundreds, if not thousands of years, with a traditional clergyman dressed in what looks like a frock and a collar, and interesting headwear and scarves and things. You may go to a church where people dress in jeans and t-shirts and play loud music. None of this matters so long as you have found a church that works for you. Because all of those things are about style, preference, and what works for us, much as we might choose our supermarket, depending on what kind of food we buy, and things like budget. But make sure that you belong to a church that is able to support and care for those who belong to it. Connect with Christians online, with churches online that will be supportive. Go to groups online that are supportive. Gather with those, albeit at the moment electronically, who will improve the way you feel rather than make you feel worse. Tell your church leaders. It's often very difficult when we are depressed or anxious to speak to the one person that is perhaps more likely than anyone else to be able to help, a church leader. Letting them know can make us feel embarrassed, guilty, feeling like failures, or perhaps we're afraid that they'll be judgmental. Church leaders, I speak as one, are generally not like that. If they are, they probably shouldn't be doing what they are doing. We have these fears, though, don't we? I'll be condemned for my lack of faith and commitment. They won't understand how I feel. My difficulties will become known by the entire church, and they will all be discussing my personal problems. Maybe I'll be forced to undergo some form of counselling or ministry, and that frightens me. Now, I can't promise that those sorts of things never happen to people who experience poor mental health. But I can say that the vast majority, church leaders, pastors, ministers, vicars, and so on, are understanding, are compassionate, and are very good at keeping their mouths shut and holding confidences. Most of us do the job because we have a desire to help people in need, and because God has entrusted a flock to us. I can say this as a pastor. You get to feel incredibly protective about your flock once you've got to know them for a while. Most will be understanding, sympathetic, and supportive, and do all they can to help you in the process of restoring good mental health. Your diagnosis won't be the subject of gossip. The ministry you receive will be gentle and loving. But if you don't say anything, how are people going to know? So, some questions. Have you told any fellow Christians or your church leaders that you're feeling anxious or depressed? If not, try to work out why. What are your thoughts and fears about what might happen if you told them? How could telling a fellow Christian church leader or church leader be helpful for you and, for that matter, for them? Who in your church fellowship could you trust with the information? If possible, make a definite plan to speak to somebody about it, perhaps when you reach the end of this video. And then avoid or reduce your exposure to unhelpful relationships. Having people around you who can share with you and support you until you recover is a great advantage in dealing with anxiety and depression. The right kind of friendship and support, particularly if it comes from another Christian, can helpfully assist the process of recovery a great deal. On the other hand, sometimes the support that is offered, no matter how well-intentioned, is quite unhelpful. Unhelpful relationships are ones that worsen how you feel. It is important that you think carefully about which people you choose to spend time with when you are feeling unwell, the amount of time you spend with them, and the type of input you receive from them. This is especially important in the area of friendships and may mean choosing to relate mostly to those who will have a helpful influence on you and choosing to keep at arm's length for a time those whose input is more unhelpful and worsens how you feel. A couple of things in particular to avoid. Try not to gather around yourselves people who are depressed or anxious themselves. What often happens is that people with depression or anxiety gather together because they want to be a support for one another. And indeed, that can happen. But sadly, what more often happens is that they drag each other down. The people mostly you want around you are people with good mental health who will make you feel better. If that sounds a little bit directive, I apologize for that. It's born of experience of being a minister and seeing people with depression, meeting with others with depression, and the effect being that they both get to feel worse. Try to make sure that you are largely surrounded or largely engaged with people with good mental health. Avoid people who make unhelpful comments that add to your distress. There are people who don't cope with you having a mental illness of any sort, particularly depression or anxiety. They will say you're not supposed to feel like this. They will say there is something wrong with you if you feel like this. They will want to analyze what's going on in your life. They will want to pray out the evil that is in you. They'll want you to think up all the ways you might have sinned and done wrong and confess it. And what is sadly happening often with people who really want to get involved in your life and tell you how to live it, what is often happening is that they are trying to meet their own needs and resolve their own issues rather than to help you. Sometimes people will tell you to do the wrong thing. They will tell you, go to church more or go to more online church. Increase your level of faith. You don't have enough faith. How you do this, don't ask me. I've never found out. You need to increase your level of faith. Confess your sins and possibly those of your parents and your grandparents and your great-grandparents. Seek deliverance from a curse or from the evil spirits that are afflicting you. If you hear people saying those sorts of things to you, go to church more, believe more, confess your sin and those of your ancestors, seek deliverance. Then generally speaking, those people are best avoided. They will not help you to get well. Be careful also if you are directed to an organisation or to individuals who supposedly specialise in ministry or deliverance in mental health. We'll say a little bit more about this when dealing with church leaders. There are folk who think they have a ministry of deliverance for people with depression and anxiety. Nearly all of the time, the best way to help people with depression or anxiety is for sure to pray with them, to walk with them, to love and to understand, and to be patient and to work through, perhaps with mental health professionals, until people come through the other side of their anxiety and depression. Quick spiritual fixes generally do not work. So try not to look for the quick fix, because generally it isn't there. And sometimes what God is doing in our depression and anxiety, what God is doing is taking us through a process of growth so that we will be stronger. One Christian psychiatrist writer has described it as God's gymnasium. We are in training to deal with stuff that is in our lives that may go back a long way, and God is helping us to overcome it. And church at its best can be great, but seek Christian friends who will support and encourage, won't give you quick fix solutions, won't send you off somewhere to be prayed for by specialist ministry, but will simply walk you through the different steps that are needed to help you, and will hold your hand, and whatever happens to you, they will always be there for you. In general terms, God chooses to work through the local church and has placed within most fellowships gifts and ministries that you need. So seek support, if possible, and prayer from the fellowship to which you belong first. They may not be perfect, but they will be there for you the next time you need help. If possible, remain engaged with your church. Remain engaged with your church leaders, with your friends, those who can support you, but only those who support you. And don't be rude, but keep your distance from people who actually make you feel worse. If you find yourself in a situation, very sadly it occasionally occurs, where church leaders simply don't understand, where they are telling you there are simple solutions of snapping out of it or breaking a curse or being delivered from your demons, or that you need to do any one of the unhelpful things that I outlined a little while ago, sadly, it may be the case that you need to think of finding a different church with which you can engage. But do that with a great deal of caution. So establish good relationships with those who can offer you loving support. Gather around you, relate to people who will support you unconditionally, people who accept you for what you are, people who will offer you sensible and practical advice rather than spiritualized solutions all the time. People who will allow you space to make your own decisions. People who will be patient if you find yourself going backwards a step or two. If you can find just one Christian friend who will act in that way, be prepared to stick with you for as long as it takes, then you will have made a very useful discovery. It might help you to have a simple, prepared one-line response for those who don't really know you well or you wish you don't particularly want to confide in. An example might be, I've been feeling really tired and washed out, but I'm getting through it now, thank you. Yet this dreaded question, how are you doing? So much want to say, all right. But something like, if it's obvious that you've been struggling, I've been feeling a bit tired, a bit washed out, a bit down, but I'm getting through it now, thank you. And leave it to rest there. Now, there is a little bit at the end of this chapter that I'll dwell on briefly for what happens if you are a leader of a church, whether you are the leader of the church or in a leadership position. You may have other fears and anxieties that your reputation will be damaged. Your credibility as a leader will be undermined if you're feeling depressed or anxious. In practical terms, in reality, there's no reason for anybody to feel any less respectful of you. And actually, in my experience, most church folk are very encouraged when a leader or a minister or a clergyman says, I'm actually suffering a bit from depression at the minute. I was stunned one day to meet a Christian psychiatrist whose almost first words were to me were, I'm actually suffering from mild depression at the minute. And I thought, that's so encouraging to hear that can happen to someone like yourself. The reality is that if you're a church leader, particularly if you are the main church leader, there are stresses and pressures, and in my opinion, those pressures and stresses are greater now than they've ever been in my time in ministry. And I'm just coming to the end of my my ministry in terms of full-time employment. It's harder now in many ways. It's more demanding. There are more stresses on your mental health than there have ever been. And things like this can happen to us as well. And being able to tell people that we are depressed should be no different from telling them I've got chickenpox or something. But church responsibilities may be an additional problem. You may be a leader in a group, you may be a Sunday school leader, you may be part of a worship group, or simply responsible for making things happen. You may be on endless rotas. I used to have a church that had a notice board full of rotas, and every Sunday your name would be on it for something. Almost certainly you'll feel your obligation to be there, to do your bit, to do your leadership task. Others may exert pressure on you to keep performing a task. If you are a lay leader and you have a minister, you might find the minister is wanting you not to lay down any responsibility, but in fact to take on more. You may belong to a small fellowship where every available body counts, and you feel the intense pressure to keep doing your job or jobs. You may be one of those people who sets themselves very high standards and prone to take too much responsibility on yourself. Time after time, people with leadership responsibilities try just to keep going when they're experiencing anxiety or depression. This is an admirable desire, but in reality, it is generally counterproductive. It's counterproductive in much the same way as it would be to keep walking on a broken ankle. Instead of reducing their level of input into church life to match what they can manage, there is a grim determination not to give in, along with a belief that the problem will just pass. Sometimes It does, though the recovery process will almost always take longer this way. Much as if you have the flu, have a bad cold, spending a day in bed will mean you make a rapid recovery. Trying to carry on will mean that your recovery takes longer. It is the same with mental health. More often, though, rather than recovering, the result of this gallant effort to keep going will be that the point comes where you crash. You can no longer cope with anything. The work we are doing just comes to a grinding halt anyway. And the church then has two problems: the pastoral care of the person who is now really unwell, and the second problem of how to arrange for their work to be covered by others. Try to resist the pressure just to keep going, because you might say, well, who will do it if I don't do it? Ultimately, if you adopt that approach, you will not do either yourself or your fellowship any favours, because you will crash out yourself, and then the work, the things that you are doing, won't be done anyway. So if you are in a position of leadership and finding it difficult to cope, it is almost always better to scale down what you do. Whatever the response of those in your fellowship, give yourself the time and space you need to recover, and allow yourself the luxury of not wondering how the church will manage without you. Can I say, as a pastor of some 35 odd years, and most of them have been odd, I have found it discombobulating, disconcerting, and sometimes, if I'm honest, slightly disappointing how well churches that I've led have managed without me. They really do. You are not nearly as indispensable as you think. It's difficult to give definite rules about how much you should keep doing, since the extent of your depression, anxiety, and your church roles and responsibilities will determine this. Perhaps the simplest approach is to see the depression or anxiety as you would any other illness. If you have a minor cold, you may feel well able to carry on as almost as normal. But if you have the flu, you need to stop doing almost everything. And I don't mean man flu. If you're a bloke and you're watching this, flu is when you just have zero energy and you just want to collapse and sleep for days and days and days at an end. It isn't when you're blowing your nose rather too often and have the sniffles. That is not the flu. That's just for the men. The women that know that that's the case. Sometimes we have to stop. Sometimes we have to finish. Sometimes we have to let go. And sometimes, if you're a church leader, what you need to do is to be vulnerable. Take the church lay leadership into your confidence and tell them that you're struggling. You'll almost certainly find that they will be understanding, compassionate, and they will help you. And if they're not like that, then I'd be getting out of there anyway, if I were you. And if folk from my church are watching, you're wonderful. Just saying no is important. It can be quite difficult, can't it, in church life? I find myself doing this. I want to say no, and I go, no, yes. It can be really hard. Where every available worker seems desperately needed, pressure is frequently exerted to carry on. Being able to assert yourself and just say no is actually really good. And it's really therapeutic. And it's actually a sign of improving mental health to be able to say no, because my self-esteem is not bound up in what I do. It's important that we avoid doing jobs and performing multiple functions that have the effect of delaying our recovery and possibly even make us feel worse. Again, a one-line statement is quite helpful. Can I suggest, if you're a leader, focus on the things that you enjoy. Focus on the things, perhaps, that you are still able to do that really have to be done, and don't focus on the things about which people are clamouring, but which actually aren't that important. There's a big difference between the urgent and the important. But do the things that bring you pleasure and satisfaction and fulfillment, and be willing to let go of the things that just become a drudge if you're experiencing poor mental health. So here's a summary. Tell your church leaders in confidence how you feel. Seek out trustworthy Christian friends who will allow you to talk and pray with you, support you in a helpful manner. Reduce or avoid dependent or critical relationships for the time being. Try to keep going to church in some fashion, but consider going to fewer services or different services. Choose quieter services, maybe. Don't hang around if you have one of these churches where you have a lot of chat before and after, albeit online, on Zoom or something. Arrive just before the start, leave at the end, so that you don't feel you're placed in a position of vulnerability. And as a last resort, and I stress as a last resort, if your church is bad for you and unhelpful and is remaining that way, and people are critical and condemnatory and are trying to give you simple solutions, you may find it necessary, sadly, to find another church and go somewhere else. So here is a closing prayer. And well done if you've stuck with this all the way through, and if you come back and you've had to break it in half, well done as well. That's fine. And here is a closing prayer that's at the end of the chapter. Lord, thank you that you have placed me within a body of local believers. Please can you give me wisdom in what to say to them, show me who to confide in, help me to find those who can provide the best support. Lord, sometimes I find it difficult praying, reading the Bible and going to church. Help me to reach the right balance of time spent with you, both at home and also at church. Give grace, patience and wisdom to our church leaders and fellowship and ministry teams. Help me to seek out helpful relationships. Please give me the wisdom and grace to know if I need to cut down seeing anyone at the moment whose impact on me is unhelpful. Help me to do this in ways that don't hurt and upset these, my friends. Lord, thank you for your love, your forgiveness, and your support. Amen. So thank you for listening, and there will be another couple of these to come. One on mental health services and how we can use them and gain the best from them, and then a final chapter on practical help for church leaders, and that'll be happening in the next week or two. Thanks for listening, and bless you. And I hope, if you are struggling, I hope and pray that you're able to find and receive the support that you need. Bless you. Bye-bye.